A gleaming black sedan, unlike anything Corporal Klaus Richter had seen outside propaganda films, glided silently along a paved road, leaving the grim, wire-fenced confines of the camp far behind. Klaus, pressed against the worn fabric of the seat, felt a strange mix of dread and bewildered curiosity. He shared the back with Sergeant Gruber, whose perpetually furrowed brow seemed etched deeper now, and Hans, the quiet farmer, who simply stared out the window with unblinking eyes. In the front, next to the elderly chauffeur, sat Eric, the cynical student, occasionally offering a dry, whispered remark about the absurdity of their situation. They had expected a rough truck, perhaps a cattle car, definitely not this plush, almost comfortable conveyance. Each mile deepened their unease. The landscape outside transformed from the barren uniform fields surrounding the camp into rolling hills, then into manicured lawns and stately homes partially hidden by ancient trees. This was not the broken, war-ravaged Europe they knew. This was a world of undisturbed prosperity, a fact that gnawed at Klaus's carefully constructed understanding of the enemy. When the sedan finally turned off the main road and ascended a long, winding driveway, their destination revealed itself. It was not a military installation, nor a repurposed factory, but a house of staggering proportions. A mansion truly built of stone and timber, sprawling across a vast expanse of green. Light, soft and inviting, spilled from numerous windows, illuminating carefully tended gardens. The air, crisp and cool, carried the faint scent of cut grass and something sweet, perhaps honeysuckle. There were no watchtowers, no armed guards patrolling a perimeter. The only sound was the gentle crunch of gravel under the tires and the distant melodic chirping of unseen birds. This was the first profound shock. Their minds, conditioned by years of wartime rhetoric, had painted a picture of a nation driven by ruthless efficiency, devoid of such overt domestic tranquility, especially for its supposed enemies. The car stopped before a grand oak door, flanked by ornate lanterns. Before the chauffeur could even step out, the door swung open, revealing not a stern officer, but a man of medium height, perhaps in his late 50s, with kind eyes and a warm, if somewhat formal, smile. He wore a tweed jacket and a patterned tie, looking more like a university professor than a captor. This was Arthur Vance. He extended a hand, first to Sergeant Gruber, then to Klaus, a gesture so utterly unexpected that Klaus hesitated for a fraction of a second before accepting it. Vance's grip was firm, his voice calm as he welcomed them, speaking a surprisingly clear German, albeit with a distinct American cadence. He said they were guests, not prisoners, and that he hoped their stay would be comfortable. The words hung in the air, alien and disorienting. Guests? In the enemy's house? Inside, the warmth enveloped them, both literally from the crackling fire in a vast stone fireplace, and figuratively from the atmosphere. The entrance hall was cavernous, yet inviting, filled with dark wood, polished brass, and the subtle scent of old books and beeswax. Sunlight, now fading into a soft twilight, streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Klaus's eyes, accustomed to the drab austerity of barracks and the gray bleakness of the camp, struggled to process the sheer abundance. Tapestries adorned the walls, depicting pastoral scenes. A grand piano stood in one corner, its polished surface reflecting the light. There were no harsh fluorescent lights, only the soft glow of lamps and the dancing flames of the fire. Vance led them into a sitting room, where comfortable armchairs were arranged around a low table laden with refreshments. Not the watery ersatz coffee and stale bread of the camp, but real coffee, its rich aroma filling the room, alongside delicate sandwiches and small frosted cakes. Klaus watched as Sergeant Gruber, usually so stoic, stared at the spread with a mixture of suspicion and almost childlike wonder. Eric, ever the cynic, picked up a small cake, turning it over in his fingers as if expecting it to explode. Vance explained his proposal simply, his voice measured and sincere. He believed that understanding could bridge even the widest chasms of conflict. He had asked the military authorities for permission to host a small group of German soldiers, not as an act of charity, but as an experiment in human connection. He wanted his daughters, and indeed his community, to see them not as faceless enemies, but as men, and for them to see America not just as a propaganda image, but as a place of ordinary people. Klaus felt a tremor of something he couldn't name. It wasn't fear, not precisely, but a deep unease. Every fiber of his being, every lesson learned in the Hitler Youth, every speech heard on the radio screamed that this was a trick, a manipulation. The enemy was cunning, insidious. They offered comfort only to extract information, to break spirits. Yet, the gentle lamplight, the genuine warmth of the room, the simple offer of food, contradicted the brutality he had been taught to expect. He remembered the rigid doctrines that had shaped his youth, the unwavering belief in the moral superiority of their cause, the absolute conviction that the enemy was a monolithic force of evil. Now faced with a man offering cake and conversation, those certainties felt suddenly brittle, like old parchment crumbling at the touch. He watched as one of Vance's daughters, a young woman with a bright, open face, entered the room carrying a tray of steaming tea. She smiled hesitantly at them, a polite, unthreatening gesture. Klaus had expected hostility, perhaps contempt, certainly a cold distance. Instead, there was a quiet, almost shy welcome. This mundane act of hospitality, the simple offering of tea by a young woman who ought, by all rights, to view him with disdain, struck him with a force greater than any interrogation could have. It was a small, human interaction that began to chip away at the formidable wall of ideology he had built around himself. The world, he realized with a growing, unsettling clarity, was far more complex than the stark lines drawn by propaganda. This house, this man, these small, unexpected kindnesses were an unwritten chapter in a story he thought he already knew. His diary, tucked deep in his meager pack, felt suddenly heavy, filled with entries that now seemed to belong to another lifetime, another man. He wondered what he would write tonight. That evening, the dinner table was another tableau of bewildering abundance. Klaus sat between Hans and Sergeant Gruber, across from Mr. Vance and his two daughters, the younger one Sarah, barely a teenager, and the elder Eleanor, who had offered the tea. The table itself, long and polished, gleamed under the soft glow of a chandelier, laden with dishes Klaus could barely identify. Roasted meats, fresh vegetables in vibrant colors, bread loaves still warm from an oven, and butter, real butter, in a quantity that seemed fantastical. He remembered the meager rations, the ersatz ingredients, the constant gnawing hunger that had been a companion for years. Here, they were offered second and third helpings, urged by Mr. Vance to eat until they were full. Eleanor spoke to them in careful German, asking about their journey, about their homes, her questions devoid of judgment, only a quiet curiosity. Sarah, more shy, merely watched them with wide, innocent eyes. Sergeant Gruber, ever vigilant, ate slowly, his eyes scanning the room as if expecting an ambush, yet even he could not resist the succulence of the food. Klaus found himself eating with an almost desperate gratitude, each bite a silent refutation of the propaganda that had described America as a nation of greedy, uncivilized warmongers. This was not the stark, utilitarian efficiency of an enemy. This was the generous hospitality of a home. He noticed the laughter shared between Vance and his daughters, the easy flow of conversation, the way they spoke of trivial, everyday things, a school play, a garden project, a new book. It was a world so utterly alien to the one he had inhabited, a world where such peace and security were not just possible, but taken for granted. The simple, unburdened existence of these people, juxtaposed against the shattered remnants of his own country, created a profound dissonance within him. The days that followed continued this quiet assault on his deeply ingrained beliefs. They were not confined. They were permitted to wander the estate, to read books from Mr. Vance's extensive library, or simply to sit in the sun-drenched gardens. The only condition was that they not stray beyond the property's boundaries, a boundary marked not by barbed wire, but by a polite request. They were given clean, comfortable rooms, each with a proper bed and fresh linens, a luxury Klaus had forgotten existed. He found himself sleeping deeply for the first time in years, undisturbed by the cold, the hunger, or the distant rumble of artillery. One afternoon, Klaus discovered Eleanor playing the grand piano in the entrance hall. The melodies were unfamiliar to him, distinctly American, yet they possessed a beauty and complexity that transcended language. He stood hidden in the archway, listening as the notes filled the cavernous space, a rich resonant sound that spoke of joy and sorrow, of life lived fully. He had been taught that American culture was shallow, materialistic, devoid of true artistic depth. Yet this music, played with such skill and passion, directly contradicted that assertion. When Eleanor noticed him, she merely smiled, a gentle, inviting gesture. She asked if he liked the music. He could only nod, feeling a profound awkwardness, a sense of being exposed. He mumbled that it was beautiful, and she then offered to teach him a simple tune, if he wished. The unexpected offer of shared art, of connection through something so pure, disarmed him completely. Eric, the cynic, spent most of his time in the library, devouring books on economics and history, occasionally muttering about the capitalist excesses he observed. Yet Klaus sometimes saw him pause, a thoughtful, almost troubled expression on his face, as if the sheer volume of information, the different perspectives, were beginning to crack his carefully constructed intellectual armor. Hans, the quiet farmer, found solace in the gardens, often seen helping the estate's groundskeeper, his hands, accustomed to the earth, finding a familiar rhythm among the unfamiliar plants. Sergeant Gruber remained watchful, often speaking in low tones with Klaus about their situation, always seeking a hidden motive, a trap. He would say, "This cannot be real, Klaus. There is always a price." But even Gruber, Klaus observed, began to soften around the edges, particularly after meals, or when Mr. Vance would engage him in discussions about agriculture, a topic Gruber knew well. The sheer normalcy of it all was the most potent weapon against their ideology. There were no grand speeches, no interrogations, no attempts at re-education. Only ordinary life, lived with an ease and abundance that mocked every deprivation they had endured, every sacrifice they had been told was necessary. The radio in the sitting room, playing jazz and news, spoke of a world recovering, rebuilding, not one consumed by hatred. Klaus would often find himself listening, trying to piece together the narrative of this new reality, a narrative so different from the one he had been fed. He began to see the faces of the Vance family, not as representatives of an enemy nation, but as individuals, each with their own hopes and concerns. The rigid categories of us and them began to blur, dissolving into the complexity of human interaction. His diary remained largely unwritten, the stark black and white of his former worldview unable to capture the nuanced shades of gray he was now experiencing. The words he had once used to describe the enemy felt hollow, absurd, in this house of unexpected kindness. One crisp autumn morning, Mr. Vance suggested a walk into the nearby town. Sergeant Gruber immediately voiced his suspicion, asking if this was a prelude to public display or forced labor. Vance, however, merely smiled, assuring them it was simply an opportunity to stretch their legs and observe local life, under Eleanor's quiet supervision. The idea of walking freely through an enemy town, even with a chaperone, was another jarring contradiction to everything Klaus had been taught. They had expected to be kept in isolation, to be paraded as defeated foes, not to be offered a stroll among the very people they had been taught to despise. The town itself was a modest collection of brick and clapboard buildings, vibrant with activity. Children rode bicycles down tree-lined streets, their laughter echoing in the cool air. Women chatted outside a small grocery store, their baskets overflowing with fresh produce. The shop windows displayed an astonishing array of goods, brightly colored fabrics, shoes, toys, and an abundance of food that made Klaus's stomach clench with a mixture of longing and disbelief. He remembered the ration cards, the empty shelves, the constant search for sustenance in the war-torn cities. Here, prosperity seemed not just present, but casually assumed, a backdrop to everyday existence. He saw a bakery, its glass front revealing rows of elaborate pastries and loaves of white bread, so different from the dark, coarse bread of his homeland. The smell of warm sugar and yeast drifted out, a scent of pure, unadulterated plenty. Klaus found himself observing the people, not as caricatures of the enemy, but as individuals. They moved with an easy confidence, their faces unburdened by the weariness he had grown so accustomed to seeing. Some glanced at the four uniformed Germans, but their expressions were more curious than hostile, sometimes even offering a polite, if hesitant, nod. This lack of overt animosity was perhaps the most unsettling discovery of all. He had been prepared for hatred, for scorn, for any manifestation of the enemy's vengeful spirit. Instead, he found only a quiet, almost indifferent normalcy. Later that week, a small group of Mr. Vance's neighbors visited, bringing pies and engaging in polite conversation. Klaus watched, fascinated, as one woman spoke to Hans about his experiences as a farmer, expressing genuine interest in the soil and climate of Bavaria. Another, a retired schoolteacher, discussed classical German literature with Eric, debating Schiller and Goethe with an unexpected depth of knowledge. Eleanor translated when necessary, but often the conversation flowed, finding common ground in shared human interests. It was a stark departure from the monolithic image of the enemy, an image of a cultureless, materialistic people devoid of intellectual curiosity. These were not the barbarians of propaganda. They were educated, kind, and surprisingly open. Sergeant Gruber, though still wary, found himself drawn into a discussion about the mechanical intricacies of American farm equipment with one of the male visitors. Klaus saw a flicker of genuine interest in Gruber's eyes, a brief respite from his perpetual suspicion. Even Eric, usually quick with a sarcastic retort about capitalist decadence, seemed less inclined to cynicism. He still held his intellectual ground, but the sharpness of his critiques was blunted by the sheer humanity of the interactions. The world, Klaus realized, was not a simple binary of good and evil, but a tapestry woven with countless threads of individual lives, each with its own complexities and nuances. The abundance of food, the warmth of the house, the casual flow of information from the radio, the shared music, the unexpected kindness, all these elements worked in concert, dismantling the edifice of Klaus's belief system brick by painstaking brick. He found himself thinking less about the grand narratives of nation and ideology, and more about the small, tangible realities of life. A fresh apple from the Vance orchard, crisp and sweet, tasted like a revelation. The soft glow of a lamp in his room, allowing him to read late into the night, felt like an immense privilege. He began to question not just the enemy's nature, but the very foundations of his own upbringing. Had the sacrifices been necessary? Had the hatred been justified? The answers, once so clear and unequivocal, now dissolved into a fog of doubt. His diary, which had once been a chronicle of his unwavering faith and grim observations of war, remained largely empty. The words he had once used to describe the enemy felt hollow, absurd, in this house of unexpected kindness. He could no longer write of their inherent evil, for he had seen their generosity. He could not speak of their cultural barrenness, for he had heard their music and seen their libraries. The stark black and white of his former worldview was unable to capture the nuanced shades of gray he was now experiencing. The certainty that had been his anchor for so long was slowly but surely slipping away, leaving him adrift in a sea of new, unsettling truths. He felt a quiet internal shift, a profound and unsettling recognition that the stories he had lived by were, in large part, fictions. The subtle, persistent normalcy of the Vance household continued its quiet work. Klaus found himself observing the smallest details with an almost scientific curiosity, each one chipping away at the grand, imposing edifice of his former beliefs. He noticed the quality of the plumbing, the consistent warmth of the water from the taps, the effortless illumination provided by the electric lights that banished the darkness with a simple flick of a switch. In his homeland, such amenities were either scarce, rationed, or damaged by war. Here, they were simply part of everyday life, taken for granted. He saw the sheer number of automobiles passing on the distant road, gleaming and new, not the few utilitarian vehicles he remembered from Germany, many converted to run on wood gas. It spoke of an industrial capacity, an untouched infrastructure that far outstripped anything he had been led to believe the enemy possessed. The propaganda had painted America as a decadent, soft nation, yet its material abundance was undeniable, a physical manifestation of a strength he now realized was far more formidable than imagined. One evening, Mr. Vance invited them to watch a motion picture in a small screening room within the house. It was a light-hearted comedy, full of laughter and simple human dilemmas, a stark contrast to the grim newsreels and patriotic dramas Klaus had grown up with. He watched the vibrant images flicker across the screen, the colorful costumes, the bustling cityscapes, the carefree expressions of the actors. He saw families laughing, couples dancing, people enjoying leisure activities in a world that seemed utterly untouched by the devastation that had consumed his own continent. The experience was profoundly disorienting. He had expected to see images of aggressive nationalism, of a people consumed by war fervor. Instead, he saw a reflection of ordinary life, a world that continued to turn, vibrant and full, while his own had been reduced to rubble and despair. He caught Hans, the farmer, chuckling quietly at one point, a rare, unburdened sound from him. Even Sergeant Gruber, though he maintained his usual stoic posture, watched the film with an intensity that suggested a grudging fascination. The library became a sanctuary for Eric, who, despite his initial cynicism, found himself spending hours poring over volumes of American literature, philosophy, and history. Klaus would sometimes see him deep in thought, a book open on his lap, his usual argumentative spirit subdued by the sheer breadth of perspectives presented. Eric once remarked, his voice unusually quiet, that the enemy's intellectual life was far more varied and complex than he had ever imagined, a concession that surprised Klaus. It was a small admission, but for Eric, it was monumental. He was discovering that the enemy possessed not just material wealth, but a rich cultural and intellectual landscape that defied the simplistic caricatures he had internalized. For Klaus, the most profound revelations often came in moments of quiet reflection, alone in his room or walking through the gardens. He would hold a fresh apple from the orchard, its skin unblemished, its taste a sweet burst of forgotten flavor, and the simple act of eating became a meditation on abundance and peace. He remembered the hunger, the constant dull ache in his stomach, the desperate ingenuity required to find sustenance. Here, food was not merely fuel, it was pleasure, comfort, a symbol of an undisturbed life. He began to write again in his diary, but the entries were different now. No longer filled with ideological fervor, they were questioning, uncertain, grappling with the profound dissonance between his indoctrinated past and his bewildering present. He found himself sketching, not military plans, but the gentle curve of a rose petal, the intricate pattern of a tapestry, the serene face of Eleanor as she read silently in the living room. Each stroke was an attempt to capture a reality that defied explanation, a world that refused to conform to the stark, unforgiving lines of his old worldview. The quiet spell could not last forever. One crisp morning, Mr. Vance gathered them. His voice held gentle finality. Their transfer orders had arrived. They were to return to a larger POW camp for repatriation. The news, though expected, landed with a heavy thud, a stark reminder of the world beyond the estate's lawns. Sergeant Gruber nodded grimly, a subtle sadness in his gaze. Eric closed his book with a sigh. Hans simply stared at his hands. That evening, the final dinner was a quiet affair of unspoken farewells. Eleanor and Sarah served a special roast chicken and homemade apple pie, a last taste of abundance. Mr. Vance spoke of future hope, of healing, devoid of triumphalism. He shook each man's hand, a gesture of respect. Klaus, gripping Vance's hand, felt profound gratitude mingled with deep loss. He had arrived a soldier, hardened by doctrine, expecting scorn. He left, knowing with certainty he was no longer the same man. His diary, now filled with questions and Beauty's sketches, was a testament to an internal war he had strangely won. The next morning, the black sedan arrived. As they drove away, Klaus looked back at the mansion. The contrast between camp's stark reality and this home's kindness carved a chasm in his soul. Ideology's rigid walls, built by propaganda, eroded gently by human connection, shared meals and abundance louder than any speech. He carried not just comfort's memory, but the unsettling realization that the enemy was not monolithic evil, but complex individuals capable of profound generosity. His future was uncertain, but his understanding of humanity irrevocably transformed. Reconciling these new truths with his old world would define him. And so, the story of Corporal Klaus Richter and his comrades, born from war's ashes, concludes not with a battle, but a quiet, internal revolution. Empathy, it reminds us, can transcend deepest divides, challenging entrenched beliefs and revealing a world more nuanced than propaganda allows. This narrative attests to ideology's fragility against lived experience and strength in kindness. If this transformation compelled you, please like, share your thoughts, and subscribe for more untold history.